For 11 years, a boy from the fishing docks of Nova Scotia woke before sunrise every single morning, not to mend nets, not to haul traps, but to pray. His knees wore grooves into the wooden floor of his bedroom. His mother thought he was sick. His father thought he was wasting the best hours of a working day. The other boys in Lunenburg thought he was strange, and they were all, in a certain sense, right. Because what was growing inside Thomas Harwick was not normal. It was not safe, and it would not stay quiet for long. Thomas Harwick was born in 1871 in a small fishing community on the south shore of Nova Scotia, the third son of a cod fisherman named Elias and a Presbyterian woman named Agnes, who read her Bible the way other women read the weather, quietly, carefully, looking for signs. The house had 4 rooms and 7 children. What it lacked in space, it made up in the sound of hymns Agnes sang while she worked, low and steady, as if she was always in the middle of a conversation with someone no one else could see. Thomas grew up on the water. By age 9 he could navigate fog. By 11 he could read wind. But the thing that held him was not the sea. It was the little white church on the hill above the harbor, where on Sunday mornings the minister, a red-faced man named Reverend Aldous, preached with the measured certainty of a man who had never once doubted anything in his life. Thomas sat in the third pew and listened, and the more he listened, the more something inside him grew unsatisfied. Not with God, with the distance. The church felt like a portrait of something that should have been alive. He was 12 years old when he first knelt beside his bed and refused to get up until something changed. He was not sure what he was asking for. He only knew there was a fire somewhere that he had not yet reached, and he was going to keep walking toward it. By the time Thomas was 17, he had read his Bible cover to cover 4 times. He had worn out 2 copies. He had started attending the Methodist meetings in the next town, walking 4 miles each way in winter, because the singing there was different, looser, less controlled, like something was being let out rather than held in. He did not tell his father about the Methodist meetings. Elias Harwick was a Presbyterian to his bones and regarded Methodists the way he regarded bad weather. Something you endured when you had to, and avoided when you could. At 18, Thomas made a promise. He wrote it in the inside cover of his third Bible, in the careful handwriting of a boy who had taught himself to read by the light of a lamp. After his family had gone to sleep, he wrote, "I will not stop until I see this country awakened." He did not know what that meant. He would spend the rest of his life finding out. In 1890, Thomas left Lunenburg. He had been accepted to a small theological college in Halifax, a place that trained ministers for the rural maritime parishes, where churches sat half empty on Sunday mornings and full-time ministers could not be found. He arrived with a second-hand trunk, $11, and the absolute certainty that God had sent him, which the college found admirable but also somewhat inconvenient. He was not the most disciplined student. He forgot deadlines. He missed lectures because he had stayed up all night in the college chapel. He once caused a minor disruption in a homiletics class by standing up to say that the sermon structure they were learning was technically correct and spiritually dead, a comment which his professor did not forget, and Thomas did not apologize for. What Thomas could do, what no one had taught him and no one could have, was pray and preach. When he opened his mouth in the small student chapel, something happened that had no name in the course curriculum. People wept. People confessed things they had never said aloud. A second-year student from Prince Edward Island came forward and told the gathering that he had been lying to his family about who he was for 6 years and felt for the first time that he did not need to anymore. The chapel was silent for 40 seconds after that. Then it was not silent at all. Word spread the way word spreads in small institutions, quietly, rapidly, and slightly out of control. His professors did not know what to do with him. He was not wrong about anything they could clearly identify. He was just something outside their categories. He graduated in 1893 and was assigned to a rural circuit in Cape Breton, 3 small churches spread across 50 kilometers of road that became impassable in February and unreliable in March. He was 22 years old. He had no horse for the first year and walked between his congregations. His combined Sunday attendance across all 3 churches was 47 people, most of them elderly, most of them cold, many of them skeptical of a young man from the mainland who talked about the Holy Spirit the way their grandmothers had, with an intimacy that made them slightly uncomfortable. He visited every home. He sat at kitchen tables and drank tea he did not want, and listened to people he had nothing obvious in common with. He prayed with a coal miner whose hands shook from 30 years underground. He prayed with a widow who had not spoken to her sister in 12 years over a boundary dispute involving 40 feet of fencing. He sat for 3 hours with a fisherman named Roderick, who had not been to church since 1879, and who told Thomas, with some hostility, that if God existed, he had not shown much interest in Cape Breton. Thomas listened to all of it, and then he came back. He came back the next week and the week after that, not because anyone asked him to, but because something in him could not leave. His landlady, a widow named Mrs. McPherson, who charged him $4 a month and worried about his eating, once asked him why he kept visiting people who had made it clear they did not want ministry. He said, "They want something. They just don't know it's the same thing I'm bringing." By 1896, something had shifted in Cape Breton. It was not dramatic at first. It was small. A prayer meeting that started with 5 people grew to 20. A man who had not spoken to his brother in 4 years drove 12 kilometers in a February snowstorm to knock on a door and say he was sorry. A pub in one of the villages began to see its Thursday evening trade drop, not because of any campaign or petition, but because the men who used to come were at a meeting instead, and the meeting had something the pub did not. Thomas never advertised what was happening. He did not write to newspapers. He was suspicious, in fact, of anything that drew attention to itself before God had finished building it. He had a phrase he used often, to himself more than anyone else: "Don't name the fire before it's hot." But the fire was getting hot. By 1897, the 3 churches on his circuit had merged their prayer meetings and were drawing people from 2 counties. A revival historian who visited that year, a professor from Dalhousie who had been studying religious movements in the Maritimes, wrote in his journal that he had attended a meeting in a small Cape Breton church and witnessed what he could only describe as a corporate encounter with the living God, adding, with the careful reservation of an academic who does not want to be wrong, that he had no secular framework for what he had seen. News reached the denominational offices in Halifax. Requests came in from churches across Nova Scotia, and then New Brunswick, asking Thomas to visit, to hold meetings, to bring whatever this was to places that had grown dry and formal and tired. He went. He slept on floors and in spare rooms. He ate what was offered. He preached until his voice gave out, and then he prayed in silence while others carried on around him. He was not in these years what anyone would call well. He was thin. His feet were always cold. He forgot to eat in the way that some people forget to rest. Not dramatically, just consistently, the body becoming secondary to something that demanded more of him every month. He wrote to his mother from Fredericton in 1898 and told her he felt as though he was being poured out like water, and that this was fine, that this was what he had asked for, but that he wanted her to know in case the pouring out went faster than he expected. Agnes Harwick read the letter twice, then went to her bedroom and shut the door and did not come out for an hour. When she emerged, she said nothing about it. She made supper. She sang quietly while she worked. In 1899, Thomas was invited to Scotland. The invitation came from an Edinburgh Missionary Society that had heard of the Cape Breton revival through a Canadian minister visiting Britain. They wanted Thomas to speak at a conference on spiritual renewal. He did not want to go. He was in the middle of something in the Maritimes, and leaving felt like abandonment. He prayed for 2 weeks about it, and then bought a ticket. Edinburgh surprised him. The formality surprised him. The weight of institution, the long history that pressed down on everything. The sense that things had been done a certain way for long enough that the way had become the thing. He preached at the conference, and the response was polite and serious, and nothing like what happened in Cape Breton. He was not discouraged. He understood that the soil was different. But something else happened in Edinburgh, something he had not anticipated. He met a man named Ewan Sinclair, a Scottish minister with a gift for organization and connections across the British Isles, who heard Thomas preach and immediately began talking about what was possible. A sustained tour of Scotland and England, meetings in major cities, access to the large Presbyterian and Methodist churches that had audiences measured in the hundreds, potential to reach tens of thousands of people across Britain. Ewan was energetic, persuasive, and completely certain that Thomas was the key to something enormous. Thomas found him unsettling in the way that very confident people unsettled him. Not because they were wrong exactly, but because their certainty moved so fast it left no room for anything else. He returned to Canada, but Ewan wrote. The letters were long and detailed and full of plans. Thomas answered some of them. He went back to his circuit. He preached in church halls and schoolhouses, and once, in the open air on a hillside in Cape Breton while fog rolled in off the ocean, and 40 people stood in the damp and listened without moving. Then 1901 came. It came with 3 things arriving in the same year. A letter from Ewan proposing a formal partnership, a formal request from his denomination to expand his ministry across Canada under their oversight and organizational structure, and a meeting at a conference in Halifax with a woman named Beatrice Holden. Beatrice Holden was 41 years old, recently widowed, well-read, and possessed of an absolute conviction that she knew what God was doing and how He was doing it. She had been involved in women's prayer networks across the Maritimes for 15 years. She had organizational abilities that were genuinely extraordinary. She had also, Thomas would learn later, been quietly asked to step back from 2 different ministry networks, due to concerns about her tendency to position herself as the final arbiter of spiritual direction for whoever she attached herself to. He did not learn this immediately. What he learned immediately was that Beatrice understood revival. She spoke about it with authority and feeling. She had read everything written about the Welsh revival of 1859, about Finney, about Whitefield. She asked Thomas questions no one had ever asked him, precise questions about what he believed was happening spiritually in Cape Breton, and what he thought would happen next, and what he feared. He had not talked about what he feared to anyone. He found himself answering her. By the end of the conference, Beatrice had offered to help Thomas manage his correspondence and speaking schedule, which had grown beyond what one person could handle alone. He accepted. It seemed in that moment like the arrival of exactly what he needed. It was the end of something, though he would not understand that for several years. Within 18 months, Beatrice had repositioned herself as his ministry coordinator. She handled all meeting requests. She decided which invitations Thomas accepted and which he declined. She began attending meetings not merely as an organizer but as a participant, offering commentary after Thomas spoke, gently correcting emphases she felt were unbalanced. She told him, more than once, that his early ministry in Cape Breton had been powerful but somewhat unsophisticated, and that God was calling him now to something more mature, more structured, requiring greater separation from the emotional excesses of rural revival. Thomas did not push back the way he should have. He was tired. He had been running at unsustainable pace for nearly a decade, and the tiredness had become so familiar he had stopped recognizing it as a problem. And Beatrice was competent, and competence in the middle of exhaustion is extremely persuasive. She began declining invitations from the rural maritime churches without telling him. When he discovered this, she explained that those churches were not the right platform for where God was taking his ministry. He disagreed, but did not fight it. She began turning away visitors, including ministers who had known Thomas for years, men who had prayed with him in schoolhouses and seen the fire in Cape Breton, telling them that Thomas was not available for informal meetings, and all contact needed to go through her office. She told him, in the autumn of 1903, that the revival in Cape Breton had contained elements that she believed were not entirely of God, that certain emotional responses were spiritually suspect, that the next stage of his ministry needed to be built on greater doctrinal precision and less dependence on atmosphere and feeling. He did not know it then, but the fire was going out. By 1904, Thomas Harwick was speaking at large denominational conferences. His audiences were bigger than they had ever been in Cape Breton. His name appeared in church newspapers across Canada and the British Isles. From the outside, everything looked like expansion. But inside the meetings, something had changed. The thing that had once broken open in a small Cape Breton church The raw, uncontainable presence that made academics lose their careful language, and fishermen confess things they had carried for decades. That thing was quieter now. The meetings were organized. The responses were measured. People were moved. Some wept. But it was the weeping of a well-delivered sermon, not the weeping of a man who has met something that will not let him go. Thomas knew it. He could not say it to anyone, because Beatrice had gradually become the only person he talked to about his ministry. And Beatrice did not hear things she did not want to hear. His brother Caleb came from Lunenburg in 1905 to visit him in Ottawa, where Thomas was then based. Caleb was a fisherman, direct and unimpressed by titles, and he sat across the kitchen table from his brother and said, "You don't look right, Thomas. You look like you've been told to be someone else." Thomas said he was fine. Caleb did not believe him and drove home and told his mother, who prayed and wrote a letter that took her 4 drafts to finish. By 1906, Thomas had stopped taking his Bible into his private study and just reading. He had stopped the long early morning prayer hours that had sustained him since childhood. There was always something else scheduled. Beatrice had a full calendar, and a full calendar was, she maintained, evidence of faithful stewardship of the platform God had given him. He told himself she was right. He was less and less sure. The letters from Ewan Sinclair had stopped years earlier, after Beatrice had declined 2 of Ewan's invitations without informing Thomas. When Thomas eventually found out, he was told that Ewan's vision for the ministry was not aligned with the direction God was taking things. He wrote to Ewan privately. Ewan wrote back once and said, "I wonder if you know how different you sound now." Thomas put the letter in a drawer. In 1907, he had a collapse. It was not the dramatic kind, it was the quiet kind. He was in Winnipeg, scheduled to speak at a conference of 500 ministers, and he sat down at the edge of his bed the morning of the first session and could not get up. Not physically, his body was present, but the thing that had always risen in him when he opened his Bible, that current that had been there since he was 12 years old with his knees on the floor, it was not there. He sat and waited for it. He was still sitting there when Beatrice knocked on the door to tell him it was time to leave. He did not tell her what had happened. He went and spoke. The ministers took notes. The conference was, by every external measure, a success. But something had broken, or not broken exactly, been slowly taken apart piece by piece, across 5 years of someone else deciding what he was for. He went home to Nova Scotia in 1908. He did not announce a retirement. He simply stopped accepting invitations. Beatrice was furious. She wrote long letters about stewardship and platform and the people who needed him. He did not answer most of them. He went to his mother's house in Lunenburg and sat in the kitchen, and Agnes made tea, and they did not talk about ministry for 3 days. On the 4th day, Thomas went back to the little white church on the hill. It was a weekday, and the church was empty. He sat in the 3rd pew where he had sat as a boy and put his face in his hands. He did not preach again for 7 years. He lived quietly. He helped Caleb on the water sometimes. He read. He wrote in a journal that he did not show anyone. People who had known him in the revival years heard he was in Lunenburg and came to find him, and he received them, but gently, at a distance, like a man who has come back from something far away and is still finding his feet. Ewan Sinclair visited in 1910. He came from Edinburgh, which was not a small thing. He sat with Thomas on the porch above the harbor, and they talked for 4 hours. When he left, he said to Thomas, "The thing that was in you is still in you." She did not take it. She just covered it. Thomas thought about that for a long time. In 1915, he began to pray again. Not the structured, managed intercession that Beatrice had approved of, but the long, undirected, sometimes wordless prayer of his Cape Breton years, the kind that felt like pouring yourself into a dark room and waiting. He prayed for Canada. He prayed for the young men in the trenches in Europe. He prayed for the church that had grown large and institutional and increasingly certain of its own methods. In 1916, a young pastor named Graham from a Halifax church wrote to ask if Thomas would consider speaking at a small gathering, not a conference, just a meeting. 30 people at most. He said yes. 30 people came, and then the room held 45, and the pastor brought in chairs from next door, and someone from the street heard the singing and came in without knowing why. And by 10 o'clock at night there were people in the room weeping, and confessing and reconciling, who had not spoken in years, and the pastor of the church wrote in his report to his presbytery that he did not know how to describe what had happened, except to say it was what they had all been reading about in the old books, and could not quite believe was real. Thomas was 45 years old. He preached across Canada from 1916 until 1929. The years after the war, when the country was tired and fractured, and desperately looking for something that was not economics or politics or the management of grief. He never rebuilt the organizational infrastructure Beatrice had constructed. He traveled light. He stayed in spare rooms. He accepted invitations from small churches as readily as large ones, more readily, because the small ones had not learned yet to protect themselves from being surprised. He was recorded, finally, in 1923 by a journalist from a Toronto paper who had come to a meeting in a church hall in Oshawa, expecting something like Billy Sunday, and found instead a small man in an ordinary suit who sat quietly at the front of the room for 15 minutes before standing and speaking in a voice that the journalist later described with visible bewilderment as the kind of voice you hear in a dream about something you forgot you knew. He died in 1931 in Lunenburg, in the house where he was born, in a room that smelled like the sea. He was 60 years old. His journal from the last 2 years ran to several hundred pages. His family found it after the funeral and did not know what to do with it. His brother Caleb read the last entry aloud to his mother, who was 83 and still sharp. The last entry read, "The fire was never mine to carry. I only had to stop putting it down." Agnes Harwick said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's right." What they buried in the churchyard on the hill above Lunenburg was the body of a fisherman's son who had walked 4 miles through winter to a Methodist prayer meeting because something in him refused to be at rest until it found what it was looking for. What they could not bury was what he had left behind. The 1896 Cape Breton revival sent ripples east and west. Ministers trained in those small churches carried whatever they had caught there into communities across the country. A historian writing in 1944 traced 15 separate revival movements across Canada to men and women who had been converted or transformed in meetings Thomas Harwick had led in the Maritime provinces between 1893 and 1901. He had not managed this. He had not organized it. He had simply refused for long enough to put the fire down. There is a question underneath this story that is worth sitting with. Not the question of what Beatrice Holden took from him, though that is a real question with a real answer. The deeper question is what Thomas Harwick did in 1908 when he went quiet. He did not fight. He did not expose. He went home and let the original thing find him again. He went back to the beginning, to the boy on his knees beside the bed who did not know what he was asking for, but knew he would not stop asking. And out of that long quiet came 15 more years of fire. The wrong alignment will cost you years. The right return will cost you pride. Both are real prices. And if the story of Thomas Harwick teaches anything, it is that the return is always possible. That what was placed in you before the interference was placed there by someone with longer patience than any human structure, and that the fire, when you stop managing it, is more than capable of finding its own way out. Are you willing to go back to the beginning? Are you willing to trade the platform for the floor? If this story moved something in you, if you have been in a room that once held fire and wonder where it went, share it with one person this week. Not because we need the numbers, because some people only hear a thing when someone they know hands it to them. And if you want to know what happens when a man's body gives out completely in the act of intercession, when a man prays so intensely that his physical heart actually shifts position in his chest, stay close. That story is coming, and it will not leave you the way it found you.